The Great War channel is turning 5 this week, and we just wanted to say thank you to everyone who watched, shared, and supported this channel for the past 5 years. We could not have done it without you out there in YouTube land. Now, if you want to support 4 more years of high-quality history content, consider pledging over at patreon.com/thegreatwar. And now, on to the show. It's July 1919, and the chaos of the post-armistice power vacuum is being filled by emerging new states competing with each other for new territory. In the former Austro-Hungarian province of East Galicia, the forces of the young Polish and West Ukrainian republics face off in a decisive showdown. Who will rule the ethnically mixed region? It's the Polish-Ukrainian War. Hi, I'm Jesse Alexander and welcome to the Great War. By the summer of 1919, Central and Eastern Europe continued to be torn apart by multiple wars between the new states that had arisen in place of the fallen empires. In the region of East Galicia, which had been a province of the Austro-Hungarian Empire until 1918, the armies of the Polish Republic and the Western Ukrainian People's Republic had been fighting for months in a back-and-forth campaign. So what were they fighting for and why? Well, the heart of the conflict was control of East Galicia. This was the homeland of Western Ukrainians, but also had deep historic ties to Poland, and had been part of previous Polish states for centuries. The region was mixed, with Poles in a slim majority in the capital city, known as Lwów in Polish, Lviv in Ukrainian, Lemberg in German, and Lemberg in Yiddish. For consistency and clarity, we will refer to it as Lemberg in this episode. In the city, Polish had replaced German as the language of public life, schools and universities, and most landowners in the region were Polish. Ukrainians formed the majority in the rest of the province and considered Lemberg to be their cultural and religious capital. In most towns, there was also a large Jewish minority. Now, between 1914 and 1916, the region had seen titanic battles, and as the end of the Austro-Hungarian Empire drew in sight, both Poles and Ukrainians laid claim to East Galicia. Now, some anticipated a coming conflict, like the Ukrainian National Congress in Kiev in 1917. The Ukrainian people will not tolerate any attempts to seize the rights to the territory of Ukraine covered with her sweat and blood. Once the Central Powers had been defeated, the puppet Ukrainian state they had set up in the aftermath of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk collapsed, plunging Ukraine into chaos. When Austria-Hungary itself began to fall apart in the fall of 1918, tensions in Lemberg reached a boiling point. On October 31st, Ukrainian paramilitaries made up of former Austro-Hungarian units led by Dmytro Witowski seized control of the city and interned the Austrian governor, even as the Poles had been planning to take over the city as well. The next day, Polish paramilitaries and volunteers, many of them teenagers known as Lwów Iglitz, struck back, and bitter small-scale clashes began. Over the next 3 weeks, both sides executed civilians, took hostages, and killed prisoners. Now, these atrocities were not government organized, since there was barely a Polish or West Ukrainian functioning state at this stage, but were the result of paramilitary violence and a power vacuum. Jewish residents formed a self-defense militia that stayed neutral as the fight raged between their neighbors. Polish reinforcements soon arrived and took control of the city on November 22nd. After the terrible fighting in what Poles called the defense of Lwów, many Poles were angry that the Jewish militia had stayed neutral, which they equated with support for the Ukrainians. A pogrom soon raged through the Jewish quarter of the city, leaving some 70 dead and more than 440 wounded. Now, in this early stage, not everyone had wanted to fight. The Polish Catholic bishop and the Ukrainian metropolitan had issued a joint statement urging an end to the violence, but this only interrupted the fighting for a few days. Some on both sides referred to the outbreak of violence as a tragic bout of fratricidal violence, more akin to a regional civil war than a straight ethnic conflict. Polish Captain Karol Baczynski recalled, "In my unit, I had to start putting together patrols to start looking for volunteers for the military among anybody between 20 and 40 years of age. We searched every single house in the whole quarter and handed those taken to the medical commission. Despite any opposition, of which there was a lot, these men were put into uniforms and immediately informed where to fight." Once the violence began, though, National feelings were strengthened. The competing new states that had suddenly sprung into the gap left by imperial collapse had mutually exclusive political goals that meant there was no turning back. As historian Jörn notes, the nationalist agenda prevailed on all sides of the ethnic divide and rendered all scenarios of peaceful cooperation void. People who surely had not always been on the best terms, but after all had got along quite well during the preceding 100 years, were now drawn into a witch's cauldron where violence often even dwarfed the disasters of the Great War, not in dimension to be sure, but by its ubiquity and atavistic nature. So now that we have an idea of the lead up to the conflict, let's take a look at each of the belligerents, starting with the Ukrainians. Now, the territories where Ukrainian-speaking people lived were at the heart of the chaos in 1919. The entire region was claimed, in whole or in part, by Poland, the White Russians, the Bolsheviks, Byelorussia, several regional warlords, and two independent Ukrainian republics, the Western Ukrainian People's Republic and the Ukrainian People's Republic. The West Ukrainian state was based in East Galicia and was led by Yevhen Petrushevich, while the Ukrainian People's Republic was led by Simon Petlura and had its capital in Kiev, when it wasn't occupied by the Bolsheviks or the Whites. Now, the two Ukrainian republics had formally united in January, but did not cooperate at a political or military level and continued to act independently. To round things off, there was also a Ukrainian Soviet government under Moscow control, based in the eastern city of Kharkiv. As if that mishmash of would-be states weren't enough, neither of the Ukrainian republics had any allies. They didn't even agree on who the main enemy was either. For the Western Ukrainians, it was Poland, which claimed most of their homeland, and Lemberg, the city they saw as their capital. For the Kiev-based state, the main threat came from the east, from both the White Russians and the Bolsheviks, who both opposed any kind of independent Ukraine. In fact, by early 1919, Petlura's army was severely weakened and had lost most of its territory. The only areas still under the Ukrainian People's Republic control were parts of the regions of Volhynia and Podolia. Now, national identity was another tricky issue for the Ukrainians. There was no traditional Ukrainian ruling class, and 90% of Ukrainian speakers were peasants, for whom religion and local identity was often stronger than ethnicity. There were efforts to build this identity, especially in Austria-Hungary after wartime oppression of Ukrainians there, but it was still not fully developed in 1919. Finally, though there was a Ukrainian and Cossack history to draw on, unlike Poland, there had been no historic independent Ukrainian state. Now, trying to create a Western Ukrainian army in these circumstances was also a Herculean task. The nascent military was under the command of General Mikhailo Emelianovich Pavienka, who had fought in the Russian Imperial Army until 1918 and would later command Ukrainian troops allied to Nazi Germany in World War II. Most of the Ukrainians in Galicia, however, had fought in the Austro-Hungarian army, and the Sich riflemen provided the core of the new units. But they were desperately short of officers, supplies, and reserves, since the population was only a few million people. So the Ukrainians were divided in their struggle to create a new state and were surrounded by powerful enemies. Now let's take a look at the situation in Poland. Now, the Polish Republic was declared in November 1918 and represented the first independent Polish state since the late 18th century. The territory where Poles lived had been completely ravaged by the fighting between 1914 and 1918, and most of its people were as destitute and hungry as their Ukrainian neighbors. And given its central location and the ethnically mixed border regions on all sides, Poland was immediately in conflict with its neighbors, with Czechoslovakia to the south, with Germany to the west, with Lithuania to the northeast, with Bolshevik Russia to the east, and with the Western Ukrainians to the southeast. The head of the Polish state, Józef Piłsudski, hoped to revive some of the character of a previous historic Polish state and establish a Polish-led confederation, including Lithuania, Ukraine, and Belarus, a plan made very difficult by rising tensions and violent clashes on all sides. His principal rival in Polish politics was Roman Dmowski. His National Democrat Party favored a nation-state with a strong Polish majority, in which minority Christian groups were to be Polonized. Now, many Poles resented the minority rights treaties forced upon them by the peace conference in Paris, which had been signed in June. Dmowski and many other Poles felt that Poland's rich history and culture put it in a leadership position, and he told the peace conference that Western Ukraine needed Polish leadership and civilization to develop. Now, since the territory of the new republic had been divided between Russia, Austria-Hungary, and Germany before 1918, organizing a new Polish army was not easy. Units and officers had different equipment, uniforms, training, and languages of command. Officers from the former Central Powers also sometimes disliked taking orders from their counterparts from the former Russian army, since the Central Powers had beaten the Russians in the Great War. Nonetheless, the Poles could draw on relatively large reserves of trained men, and had the support of the French and British military missions to Poland to help train their new army. So while the Poles faced many challenges in forming their new state, one advantage they had was some support from the Allies in Paris. Now, at the peace conference, the Big Four struggled to balance their different interests with simply getting a handle on what was happening in East Galicia. Generally speaking, the Poles were in a position to make a stronger case to the Allies than the Ukrainians, since the Polish delegation was well represented in Paris and a small, disorganized West Ukrainian delegation only arrived in May. The French were particularly staunch supporters of the Polish Republic, since they hoped a strong Poland would become a French ally and help contain a future German threat. The Poles were also seen as a potential bulwark against the spread of Bolshevism from Russia. President Wilson expressed these concerns when he said in May, "If Paderewski falls and we cut off food supplies to Poland, won't Poland herself become Bolshevik? Paderewski's government is like a dike against disorder, and perhaps the only one possible." The British and Americans were nonetheless not particularly happy about Poland's ambitious border claims or the fighting in East Galicia. David Lloyd George shared his disappointment in what he saw as Polish aggression. "It fills me with despair the way in which I have seen small nations, before they have hardly leaped into the light of freedom, beginning to oppress other races than their own." The British even tossed out the idea of giving East Galicia to the Czechoslovaks. Now, they also simply didn't know much about the Ukrainians and what exactly was going on the ground. As Wilson frankly put it, "It is very difficult for us to intervene without having a better understanding vis-à-vis the Ukrainians or the Bolsheviks." David Lloyd George put it more bluntly, "I only saw a Ukrainian once. It is the only Ukrainian I have seen, and I am not sure that I want to see any more." But the decisive factor was that the Allies simply did not take Ukrainian hopes terribly seriously, since their interests lay elsewhere. Poland was crucial to the Allies' new order, and Ukraine was not. The Big Four were still hoping for the re-establishment of a non-Bolshevik Russia and were supporting the White Russian armies fighting in the Russian Civil War. Since the Whites' Russian nationalism and ambitions to restore the empire meant they were opposed to Ukrainian independence, the Allies could hardly support it either. So the situation in East Galicia was complicated, and the region was just one in an ocean of chaos in Eastern Europe in 1919 to have become a hot potato of international diplomacy. Now let's have a look at how the fighting played out in the summer of 1919. Now, following the improvised and paramilitary fighting in Lemberg in late 1918, both sides attempted to build up their forces for larger-scale operations. After the bitter experience of the violence in Lemberg, gone was any sense of fratricide. One Polish veteran recalled the intensity of the struggle. "Hatred so impulsive we'd tear each other to pieces. There has never been a war like this. With revenge we suffocated the enemy, the beast. Hardly any prisoners were taken, on both sides. Oh Lord, these moments of terrible struggle, fighting chest to chest, with our teeth, with knives." After the initial clashes in November 1918, the Poles held Chemish with its defensive ring of forts and Lemberg and the vital railway in between the two cities. But the Ukrainians were in control of most of the countryside. Now, limited Polish attacks in December forced the Ukrainians to retreat to Ternopil and then to Stanisławiv. In January, Polish forces managed to capture the towns of Belge and Uhnów, plus an important local railway. This began a phase of offensives and counter-offensives back and forth across the region. In February, Western Ukrainian troops launched a major offensive. They cut the critical rail line between Chemish and Lemberg and surrounded the city and its Polish garrison. The Ukrainian advance left only Lemberg and Chemish in Polish hands, but the Entente now intervened. Keen to stop the fighting, they sent the Barthélemy mission to broker a truce. This only resulted in a short break in the fighting, but ceasefires between the Poles and Germans in the west and between the Poles and Czechs in the south allowed Polish reinforcements to move east. With fresh forces available, the Poles attacked again in March. They inflicted a serious defeat on the Ukrainians, recaptured the Chemish-Lemberg railway, and broke the siege of the city. The Allies again attempted to arrange a ceasefire, this time including efforts by British Colonel Adrien Carton de Villars and French officer Charles de Gaulle. These efforts would not bring a stop to the fighting, and during the lull, the Ukrainian situation got even worse. In April, the Bolshevik Red Army reached the Zbruch River in the east, and the Western Ukrainian army was forced to transfer some troops to guard their rear. Thankfully for them, the Red Army turned its attention to Petlura's forces in Walhynia and did not push west. The Poles, meanwhile, had received decisive reinforcements in the late spring. General Josef Halle's so-called Blue Army of 50,000 French trained and equipped Polish forces arrived from France, where they had fought on the Western Front against the Germans. In addition, the Romanians were now ready to join the fighting on the Polish side. Their aim was to capture the region of Pokutia in the south. Now the Poles readied 60,000 men and 5,000 horse for the offensive, and the Romanians 10,000 soldiers. To oppose them, the Ukrainians mustered just 30,000 troops and 600 cavalry. Now the Polish-Romanian offensive was a success, and the Ukrainians were once again forced to retreat, this time stopping in a cramped area between the rivers Dniester and Zbruch to regroup. General Alexander Rykov, who had fought with the Imperial Russian Army in the Great War and had just left Petlura's army, now took command of the exhausted Western Ukrainian troops. The last desperate attack of the Ukrainians, known as the Kharkiv offensive, began on June 7th. Though outnumbered, they smashed through Polish lines and advanced over 100 kilometers towards Lemberg. But time was not on the Ukrainian side, and more Polish reinforcements arrived. General Lucjan Żeligowski's division arrived in Lemberg after a 3-month march from Odessa, where they had been fighting alongside the White Russians. Pilsudski himself even took command of a Polish formation. The Poles had more troops, more weapons, and were better supplied, and managed to stop the Ukrainians just 2 days' march from Lemberg. A Polish counterattack hit the overextended and weakened Ukrainians hard, and by July 16th, Ukrainian forces had withdrawn across the Zbruch. The survivors joined with Petlura's weakened forces to push back the Bolsheviks on the eastern bank, but would never fight in Galicia again. More than 2/3 of them would die of typhus that October. Now, the end of the Polish-Ukrainian War and the virtual destruction of the West Ukrainian state had profound consequences for the people of East Galicia. About 15,000 West Ukrainian and 10,000 Polish soldiers had been killed in the fighting, and some 100,000 Ukrainians were interned in Polish custody, where 1/5 would die of disease. 3 million Ukrainians would now become citizens of a Polish republic that did not trust them and which they did not trust either. In July, the Paris Peace Conference agreed to allow Poland to administer the region, ultimately recognizing the facts on the ground, as they had done with the region of Greater Poland as well. East Galicia would formally become part of Poland in 1923. But for the moment, Poland's gains meant that it now shared a much longer border with Bolshevik Russia than it had before, and the Polish-Soviet War, smoldering further north, could now spread southward. Long-term, the war, along with Polish-Lithuanian fighting further north, meant that Pilsudski's plan for a Polish-led confederation had failed. Other than a short-lived alliance the next year, Polish-Ukrainian enmity would live on and tear the region apart again in World War II. The defeat of the West Ukrainian People's Republic by the Poles and the Ukrainian People's Republic by the Bolsheviks also ended Ukrainians' hopes for an independent state, which would not come again for the next 70 years. So now that we've seen the end of the Western Ukrainian People's Republic and the consolidation of Polish control of East Galicia, it's time for our roundup segment, where we take a look at what else is going on in July 1919. Let's start in Russia, where on July 3rd, the White Russian Armed Forces of South Russia launched a major offensive. In the recently captured city of Tsaritsyn, General Denikin issued the Moscow Directive, identifying the capital city as the main objective of the attack. By the end of the month, White cavalry from the south had linked up with White forces from the east under Admiral Kolchak near Lake Elton. Further north in Karelia, on July 8th, 2 weeks of clashes between Bolshevik forces and the Finnish Alaniec Volunteer Army brought an end to the Red Army's Widlitskaya operation, which pushed back the Finns near Lake Ladoga. On the 27th, in southeastern Ukraine, anarchist leader Niesta Makhno executed warlord and recent ally Nikifor Grigoriev, who had been planning on changing sides again to join the Whites. In Central Europe, on July 17th, the army of the Hungarian Soviet Republic attacked Romanian forces across the Tisa River and advanced up to 60 kilometers. The Romanians launched a successful counterattack, and by the end of the month, were back across the river, and the Hungarian Red Army was in retreat towards Budapest. Turning to the Middle East, on July 5th in Constantinople, a Turkish court-martial sentenced former government members Talat Pasha, Enver Pasha, Cemal Pasha and Dr. Nazim to death for the massacre of Armenians during the war. The sentence was pronounced in absentia since all the accused were abroad and was never carried out. Still in Turkey, on the 23rd, the Erzurum Conference began. Led by Mustafa Kemal and General Karabekir, the conference declared itself ready to form an alternative Turkish government to oppose the one in occupied Constantinople. It intended to resist the Allied interference in Turkish affairs. On July 19th, in the Caucasus, the Azerbaijani Republic was founded. And finally, on July 10th, the former German West African colonies of Cameroon and Togo were taken on as League of Nations mandates by France and Britain. On the same day in Germany, the Siamese Expeditionary Force leaves the Rhineland occupation to return home after 2 years in Europe. Now, as usual, you can find all our sources for this episode in the video description below, including links to our Amazon stores. To get access to all our podcast episodes with expert interviews and other perks, you can also support us on Patreon or by clicking the Join button below. I'm Jesse Alexander, and this is The Great War 1919, a production of Real-Time History and the only YouTube history channel that is not trying to rule a part of Ukraine in 1919.